Those of you who were with us last week, we saw how Jesus revealed himself as King, Messiah. Messiah means the anointed king. He's the Son of God. He has all the authority, all the power over all the forces of the world, as we saw there, spiritually, driving out demons, physically, controlling the forces of nature, even to authority over sickness, death, and all matters of life. You might have to come and put more batteries in it, honey. So to understand Christianity, we first need to understand who is this Jesus and what he has come to do. So here we have this life bridge diagram. Again, we can illustrate this by a life bridge that has 3 pillars. All pillars need to be in place to support this life bridge, or else it will collapse. And there'll be no crossing from one side to the other. Now, one side is indicating a person's unreconciled state with God. The other side is indicating a reconciled state with God. So who Jesus is and what he has done can really be summed up in these 3 pillars. But all 3 has to be accepted by a person for a reconciled life with God to be found. So these 3 pillars can be defined this way. Firstly, Jesus as King of the kingdom. The second one, his crucifixion. Jesus as the crucified one. And thirdly, his resurrection. Jesus as the risen King. So all those must be accepted for a person to cross that bridge and enter life with God. But now we see Jesus here in today's lesson revealing himself as the self-giving King by subjecting himself to a painful death. This will be the second pillar, crucifixion. And in doing so, he continues to further this plan of God in reconciliation, reconciling people with God by giving up his life in service for many, many people. You know, there was a study by the University of New South Wales, and they found that in aquatic locations in Australia and the United States, cliff falls were the most likely cause of death in selfie incidents. Taking a selfie in those kind of dangerous places. A number of people go so far as to put themselves in danger for this all-glorious photo of themselves in a picture in a beautiful location. I guess the last thing they desired was to actually fall to their deaths in the process. But in this lesson today, we find that Jesus, as God's King, has deliberately put himself in harm's way. Not for a great photo, of course, but that he might die, it says, as a ransom for many. So he intentionally came to serve as King, but a redeeming King, by giving up his life. We see in verse 45 of Mark chapter 10, "For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many." Now, what does that mean? Ransom. We don't hear that much at all today. Give his life a ransom for many. Well, consider how slavery worked in the Roman Empire. Usually most slaves were slaves for life. They were in bondage for life. However, some, particularly those who managed to be appointed to high-ranking positions, were able to save up enough money to buy back their freedom. And in doing so, they were redeeming their own life back from their owner. Or consider a group of soldiers captured by the enemy. Situation seems hopeless, but then their commander steps forward, offers himself in exchange for their freedom. The enemy accepts the deal. Soldiers go free while the commander is taken away. So this is what the sense of redemption means. Paying a price to set someone free. In giving his life as a ransom for many, Jesus gave his life in exchange for all people who wish to live under his kingdom rule. The message then is whether you wish to be part of his kingdom and live under his rule, under his authority. Knowing too that having been redeemed, those under his leadership have been freed from their, you could say, slavery to a corrupted world. So we are starting then by highlighting in this passage, Romans chapter 15, we're looking at particularly today, highlighting a Roman centurion who has seen Jesus for who he really is. Truly, he says, this man was the Son of God. So in this lesson, the true identity of Jesus is revealed, not in his life, as we saw last week, but now in his death. And when the centurion who was standing right in front of him saw the way he breathed his last, he said, truly, this man was God's Son. Jesus has been crucified alongside two others, branded as insurrectionists, and Jesus is regarded as the chief insurrectionist because he dared to claim, and as they put it above his cross there, claimed that he was King of the Jews. So there's 5 aspects to this first point that needs to be noted, and we're going to go through Mark 15 and highlight some points there. The first one is the darkness in verse 33. So as Jesus was crucified and hung on the cross, the day turned into night. As we read there, when the 6th hour came, 12 p.m., noon, middle of the day, darkness fell over the whole land until the 9th hour, that is 3 p.m. in the afternoon. So at the 6th hour, or 12 o'clock midday, of what we now call Good Friday, a darkness came over the land. And this darkness could not possibly be a solar eclipse, because at this time, Passover time, the moon is on the wrong side of the earth for a solar eclipse to happen. Darkness is an ominous sign. Most cultures of the world know regarding darkness that in the middle of the day is a bad omen, a sign of something terrible about to happen. And of course, the Jewish nation was not unfamiliar with this phenomena. You know, one of the great plagues of Egypt was when God brought darkness over the whole land. In Exodus 10, then Yahweh said to Moses, stretch out your hand toward the sky, that there may be a darkness over the land of Egypt, even a darkness which may be felt. So Moses stretched out his hand toward the sky, and there was a thick darkness in all the land of Egypt for 3 days. They did not see one another, nor did anyone rise from his place for 3 days, but all the sons of Israel had light in their places of habitation. So how long did this darkness last when Jesus was crucified? 12 o'clock to 3 o'clock? Not 3 days, but 3 hours. Also, like Israel, how long did they wander in the wilderness? 40 years, wasn't it? And how long was Jesus in the wilderness? 40 days. So this event was meant to take our attention back to those experiences of Israel. The Jews should have understood that the darkness was a sign of God's displeasure against the unbelief, the disobedience of Pharaoh. What was happening at this time as Jesus was dying on the cross? A terrible, woeful crime of unbelief had been committed. The Jews had crucified not just an innocent man, but the very one whom God sent to be king and to establish his reign, the reign of his kingdom on the earth. This darkness was an omen of judgment against Israel for their stubborn and willful unbelief. And it indicates God's displeasure at the grievous rejection of his son, the appointed king. This moves us to the second part of Jesus' crucifixion there, where he gives out a cry of forsakenness. Verse 34, the very following verse. And at the 9th hour, this is at 3 p.m, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which is translated, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, I want you to imagine for a moment a marathon runner. He's been running for hours, and as he approaches the last stretch, exhaustion overwhelms him. His muscles burn, his breath is shallow, he feels utterly alone, but he presses on. At the final kilometre, he collapses. His strength is almost gone. For a moment, he feels completely abandoned, like his body has betrayed him. Just won't keep going. And all he can do is cry out. But then, just when it seems like the end, a surge of strength comes, like a second wind. And he rises, he crosses the finish line, and he is crowned with victory. Now, that illustration is just a small picture of what Psalm 22 is ultimately about, and in why Jesus gave that cry out on the cross. So it's now the 9th hour, 3 p.m. in the afternoon. We can assume the 3 hours of darkness has now ended, departed. Jesus cries out in loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. It's Aramaic. It's actually the very first line of Psalm 22. So it's Psalm 22 verse 1. And it means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, Jesus quoted that first line of Psalm 22 verse 1 verbatim. What is going on here is that he is drawing attention to the whole psalm, not just the first line. The psalm begins in suffering, but it ends in victory, vindication, and a global kingdom. Part of this psalm is quoted in other places in the New Testament regarding Jesus' death and his kingdom. Verse 7 of Psalm 22, all who see me mock me. They hurl insults, shaking their heads. He trusts in the Lord. Let the Lord rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him. That's quoted in the New Testament, along with this one here from Psalm 22, verse 18. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. All quoted from Psalm 22. So for all intents and purposes, the psalm starts with the cry of a righteous and rightful king who is afflicted by the unrighteous. And for all appearance sake, God has abandoned this righteous one. And moreover, since God is in control of all the world, the fact that God lets him suffer, he feels like God has forsaken him. However, not all is as it appears. The psalm goes on to talk about the evil in the world, the evils of man who inflicts evil upon God's chosen one. The psalm upholds trust in God. It assures the reader that God would vindicate his chosen one in spite of the evil afflicted upon him. Here, the writer of the psalm, King David, is most likely reflecting upon his own struggles, but ultimately he's projecting forward to David's greater son, who will be God's chosen king. Look at some of the verses from the ending of the psalm. For he has not despised nor abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, nor has he hidden his face from him. But when he cried to him for help, he heard. So the psalm goes on speaking to us of a global kingdom, a people yet to be born who will trust in God, not only from Israel, but from other nations. Verse 27, 28. All the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations will worship before you. For the kingdom is the Lord's, and he rules over the nations. So for 3 hours, darkness covered the land. It seemed like evil had won, just as it seemed to David when he wrote Psalm 22. But just as David was ultimately delivered, Jesus will be raised from the dead in power. Indeed, God has heard, and 3 days later, this greater son of David will be raised from the dead in a mighty victory. The cry, my God, why have you forsaken me?" is just a precursor. It's a prelude to his vindication and resurrection. Just as the darkest hour comes before the dawn, so too the cross comes before resurrection. So we go to the third point here, which is from Mark 15, verse 35 to 37. And when some of the bystanders heard it, they began saying, "Look, he is calling for Elijah." And someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a reed and gave him a drink, saying, "Let us see whether Elijah will come and take him down." And Jesus, uttering a loud cry, breathed his last. Now, Jesus goes from the cry of the suffering king to the cry of triumph. Jesus makes one final loud call and breathed his last. But prior to this, he receives a drink of sour wine, and the sour wine is known as a thirst-quenching drink for the lower classes. It appears as though they offer it to Jesus since they're curious as to whether Elijah the prophet will come and rescue him off the cross. Now, why and where did they get this idea of Elijah from? Possibly they misheard what Jesus is saying. Eloi, Eloi is not far from Elu, which is Aramaic language. So they're perceiving that he's actually calling Elijah to come. You know, the last book of the Old Testament, Malachi, there Elijah has been anticipated to come before what is called the great and terrible day of the Lord. So the motivation to give Jesus a drink, therefore, is to keep him alive to see if Elijah is going to come. But it was straight after that Jesus decided to die. There seems to be a determined effort by Jesus now to finish things off. As we go to John 19, verse 30, it kind of clarifies what is really being said here. He records, "Therefore, when Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, 'It is finished.' And he bowed his head and gave up his spirit." It has been noted that the strength of his cry indicates that he died no ordinary death. Most times, those who get crucified could suffer for days on end, finally fall into unconsciousness through sheer exhaustion before they died. With his mission, though, now complete, Jesus gives up his life. So we go to verse 38 now with what happens next. The veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. So Jesus gives his last breath, he dies, and then this phenomena happens. The veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The curtain is likely here the outer curtain which is seen publicly. Now, I know a lot of people think it's the inner curtain, but it's likely the outer one here. The curtain is a heavy thing. It's some 25 metres high. Darkness was a public spectacle. The rending, tearing of the veil is also now a public spectacle. After Jesus breathed his last, confirming his death, which was orchestrated by who? The temple authorities, right? The veil of the temple is torn in two from top to bottom. And the tearing from top to bottom indicates that no human could have done it. It was a public sign of God's judgment, visible to all at the temple. You see, this entire system, centered on the temple, was built around a specific nation and select individuals. Only priests could serve in the temple, and only the high priest could enter the most sacred part, and only once a year. In bringing in the kingdom of God, however, God is going global. He was opening up access to himself for every individual. But the temple not only stood in his way, it had become the embodiment of a rejection of God himself. By rejecting God's king, God's Messiah, the anointed one, this religious system, epitomised by the temple itself, had turned against God. You know, for 30 years, the Berlin Wall stood as this massive barrier separating East and West Berlin. Families were divided. Loved ones could only wave from a distance. Freedom was restricted. The East German government tightly controlled access, only allowing select individuals through heavily guarded checkpoints. Then, November 9th, 1989, an unexpected announcement was made. The borders open. People are free to cross. Crowds rushed to the wall. Some climbed over. Others began tearing it down with hammers and chisels. So in an instant, a barrier that kept people apart for decades was gone. Families reunited, and for the first time in a generation, people could freely move between East and West. See, the Berlin Wall was like the veil of the temple, right? It divided people, keeping some in, others out. And paralleling that, the temple veil kept most people away from the presence of God. As the Berlin Wall was a symbol of political separation, the temple veil was a symbol of separation from God. And now we see God tearing it apart. The tearing of the outer curtain would have been publicly visible, just like the world watched as Berliners physically tore down that wall. As Jesus dies, God acts to show what is to be the sequel to his death. God is going global. The temple will no longer be needed. The torn veil is a public display, a prelude to the end of the temple and its system. Here we see the judgment of God which has fallen as a prelude to the final fall of the temple, which we know took place in AD 70. You can read about that in Mark 13. So with Jesus' death, the veil of the temple is torn in two from top to bottom. It's an act of God, and it's viewed publicly. So now we come to the final point of today's lesson. Verse 39, the declaration of the centurion. And when the centurion who was standing right in front of him saw the way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly, this man was God's son." We now come to one of the most punchy lines in Mark's gospel. We've had people not knowing and perceiving who Jesus is. We've had the religious leaders fight tooth and nail to deny Jesus any status other than being a deceiver and a sinner. Even the disciples, in the end, struggled to correctly identify him and to stay by his side. Here is the Messiah, the King, the Son of God, who has all the authority on heaven and on earth, the one who controls and holds control over the world of nature and the spiritual realm, the one who's now giving his life as a ransom for many. The betrayal, the trial, the accusations, the mockery of the soldiers and the religious leaders. We see here so packed with irony. These people could not understand who is this Jesus, who he really is. Although the demons knew, the demons understood, as we saw in the previous lesson, they know who he is. Even one of his closest disciples, Peter, who was in the courtyard of the high priest, he denied emphatically that he knows Jesus. Here's Peter. Says he began to curse and swear, "I do not know this man you are talking about." This man, this Jesus. I mean, is that what you now think, Peter? Yet here we have in this verse today, the centurion, a Roman, a Gentile, looking up at Jesus on the cross, and he says, truly, this man was God's son. Wow, what further irony here. In his death, in the way that he dies, a Roman commander sees him as the Son of God. This is one of the main themes of Mark's gospel, Jesus as Son of God. And you can go right to the very first verse where it talks about the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. This moment with the centurion is the first time these words have been uttered with conviction. Truly, this man is God's son. Without the benefit of Jewish education or of spending a long time with Jesus, he sees the way in which Jesus dies and proclaims that this man is truly God's son. What is amazing is that Jesus' last breath is powerfully uttered with what might have been the loud cry, "It is finished," which John records in his gospel. When Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, "It is finished." He bows his head and he gives up his spirit. And of course, it's not a loud cry of despair, it's one of victory. It is this final shout that says that the Father's will has been done and that he has completed his kingly role of salvation. He has been sent to accomplish this role as a Saviour King, that his life has been given as a ransom for many. So with this, we come to the end of the second lesson, the second pillar, which speaks to the meaning of the crucifixion of Christ. Of course, in the next lesson, we get to the third pillar of the gospel, which is the resurrection of Christ.